The night Nigeria held its breath. January 15th, 1966. Lagos, Nigeria. The air was thick and warm, the kind that coats your skin and never lets go. Midnight had only just passed, but the city wasn't entirely asleep. A few kerosene lamps still flickered in distant windows. Dogs barked in the distance. A patrol truck wambled slowly along the quiet streets near the federal government quarters. Captain Emmanuel Noobosi stepped out of the back of a Land Rover and felt his boots sink slightly into the soft red sand. He tightened his grip on his rifle. Sweat rolled down his back despite the darkness. Tonight wasn't just another duty. Tonight was the kind of night that would either make him a patriot or mark him a traitor forever. A few meters away, Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzogu stood under the branches of a neem tree, his beret tucked neatly on his head. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself with a sharpness that made other officers straighten without thinking. His eyes were cold with focus. He had rehearsed these hours in his mind for months. Every checkpoint, every arrest, every shot that might have to be fired. He whispered into the night, "We move in 3 minutes." No one responded. They didn't need to. Every man there felt the weight of what they were about to do. They believed Nigeria was bleeding from the inside. Corruption was swelling through the political class. Regional tensions were rising like heat under a closed pot. The young officers convinced themselves they were saving the country. But revolutions rarely arrive with clean hands. A faint breeze rustled the trees. In the distance, soldiers whispered prayers in Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa. Young men barely in their 20s. None of them knew they were lighting the fuse of a fire that would burn for decades. A radio crackled once inside the truck. "Ready?" Nzogu nodded. "Go." Everything erupted at once. Engines roared to life, boots hammered the ground, trucks surged forward. Another team split off toward the official residence of Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. Someone shouted an order. Someone else fired the warning shot too early, the blast echoing across the sleeping city like a warning from the sky. Inside the Prime Minister's residence, guards jolted the wake. A lantern fell and shattered. One man reached for a telephone line that had already been cut. The rebels pushed through the gates with the force of men who believed their moment had come. Balewa wasn't a man of violence. He was calm, gentle, deliberate. But even he could feel the panic rising as he was pulled from bed, his white gown still wrinkled from sleep. The soldiers surrounding him looked tense, their rifles trembling slightly. It wasn't hatred, it was fear. Fear of him, fear of failure, fear of the future rushing toward them faster than they could stop it. On the other side of the city, another team was already surrounding the home of Sir Amadou Bello, the powerful premier of the northern region. The rebels treated that mission like the head of a snake. Bello was influence incarnate, a man whose voice shaped much of Nigeria's political landscape. His guards fought back and gunfire ripped through the dark. One officer stumbled as a bullet grazed him. Smoke filled the air. Across Nigeria, in Kaduna, Ibadan, and Enugu, similar scenes played out. A coordinated storm. Barracks overrun, politicians arrested or killed. The young officers told themselves it was necessary, that this was the only way to stop the corruption, the ethnic mistrust, the political greed. They didn't realize that the violence they believed would cleanse the nation would instead carve deep wounds into it, wounds that would shape everything that came after. By dawn, Nigeria's elected government was falling apart at the seams. The country was confused and terrified. Radio Nigeria crackled to life with Nzogu's voice, steady yet electric. "We are in the thick of action. Our enemies are the political profiteers, the swindlers, the men in high and low places who seek bribes." People held their breath across the country. Some cheered, Some prayed, some wept. But inside the army, other officers were already stirring. Senior commanders, men who believed the coup was reckless, men who saw the killings not as salvation, but as ethnic cleansing. And at the center of that rising counterforce was one man, the quiet, disciplined, calculating head of the army, Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi. He was about to wake up to the chaos and make a decision that would change Nigeria's destiny. A decision that would ignite suspicion, ethnic fear, and eventually a second coup even bloodier than the first. Nigeria would never be the same.
Ironsi steps into the fire. Dawn settled over Lagos with a strange, uneasy silence, the kind that follows a night of gunfire. Smoke still clung to the air near Government House. A few burnt-out vehicles sat crooked on the road. Stray dogs wandered between them, confused by the smell of blood and rubber. Inside the army headquarters at Dodam Barracks, Major General Johnson Thomas Umonakwe Aguiyi Ironsi walked with the slow, composed stride of a man who had learned long ago that panic never saved anyone. He had been walking before sunrise with one sentence that sliced through the dark. "Sir, there has been a coup." He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply asked for details and grabbed his service cap. The country depended on him now more than it ever had. Ironsi was a tall, imposing figure, a soldier, calm eyes, voice steady enough to quiet a room without raising its volume. He had seen war in the Congo. He had commanded peacekeeping forces under the United Nations. But this was different. This was his own house on fire. He stepped into the command room. Officers snapped to attention. Maps lay scattered across tables, marked with pins showing confirmed attacks. Reports were coming in by the minute. "Sir, Kaduna has fallen to rebels." "Sir, the Prime Minister is missing." "Sir, Ahmadu Bello is confirmed dead." "Sir, key northern officers have been killed." Ironsi listened without blinking. Every word was a blow. Every detail painted a darker picture. These weren't random attacks. They were targeted, coordinated, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. Most of the victims were northern leaders. Most of the coup plotters were young Igbo officers. It wasn't just a coup. It looked like a message, a tribal one. Whether intentional or not didn't matter. The implications were explosive. A junior officer swallowed hard and spoke up. "Sir, what are your orders?" Ironsi took a slow breath. "We restore order. No revenge. No escalation. Bring loyal units under control." He knew what was at stake. If the army fractured along ethnic lines, Nigeria would shatter. Civil war would only be a heartbeat away. But out there in the barracks and streets, emotions were hitting fast. Northern soldiers were furious. Many believed their leaders had been executed in a targeted purge. Some whispered that Ironsi, an Igbo general, secretly supported the rebels. He heard those whispers. He ignored them. The country came first. Ironsi moved quickly. He activated loyal battalions. He sent envoys to reassure Cornevus commanders. He ordered all rebels to stand down. And most importantly, he told the nation that the army was stepping in to stop the chaos. Hours later, he finally confronted the coup plotters. Captain Nobosi, Major Ifeajuna, and others stood at attention, exhausted from the night's violence. Ironsi didn't shout at them. He didn't need to. His disappointment hit harder than anger. He asked, "Do you understand what you have done?" Silence. He continued, "You claim to save Nigeria, but you have fractured her. There is no victory in this." Some of the young officers lowered their eyes. Others stiffened. They believed they had done the right thing. They believed corruption had forced their hand. But Ironsi knew the truth. Good intentions could still drag a nation into darkness. He disarmed them and placed them under guard. Not executed, not tortured, just detained. That decision would later come back to haunt him. Many Northerners wanted blood for blood. Ironsi refused. He wanted unity, not vengeance. By nightfall, the coup had collapsed. The conspirators were in custody. Government officials, military leaders, and civilians waited to see who would take control. Nigeria was bruised, confused, afraid. Ironsi didn't seize power with a triumphant speech. He stepped forward because someone had to stop the bleeding, because the army had no other senior officer left standing, because Nigeria was drifting toward a cliff. But the moment he accepted leadership, suspicion tightened around him like a noose. Some saw him as a stabilizer. Others saw him as the silent beneficiary of a tribal coup he never planned. And deep in the north, resentment was growing like a storm cloud. Officers who had lost their mentors, their leaders, and their brothers were quietly preparing their own response. Nigeria's future was sliding towards something darker than anyone imagined.
A nation on edge. Ironsi's first days in power carried the kind of tension you could feel through the air like humidity before a storm. Lagos looked calm on the surface. Markets reopened. Buses rumbled through Marina. People lined up for newspapers, hungry for any scrap of clarity. But under that thin layer of normalcy, every region in Nigeria was holding its breath. The killings of January 15th had cracked something deep. Northern leaders were gone. Their supporters were grieving and furious. Rumors spread faster than facts. In bear parlors and army barracks, whispers grew sharp. They killed our leaders. They planned it. They were waiting for Ironsi to take over. Even when it wasn't true, fear didn't care. Fear built its own truth. Ironsi knew all of this. He could almost feel the resentment ruling toward him. Still, he kept his voice steady. He spent long nights walking through stacks of intelligence reports, notes from governors, and warnings from army units. He spoke with traditional rulers, religious leaders, and foreign diplomats. He needed every force in the country calm. Nigeria was too fragile to survive another crack. But stabilizing the wounded nation is harder than taking over one. On January 17th, Ironsi gathered top civil servants and military officers for a meeting. He addressed them with the same calm discipline he used with soldiers. He promised a return to order. He promised justice without ethnic bias. He promised that the army's intervention was temporary. Some believed him. Others sat stiffly, offering polite nods, but carrying doubts that burned quietly. A few northern officers walked out afterwards, whispering among themselves, their faces tight with grief and suspicion. But outside these halls, another fire was spreading. In the north, riots flared in pockets. Crowds gathered around radio sets. Some newspapers printed headlines that only fueled anger. Families began moving from mixed neighborhoods back to ethnic strongholds. Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, it didn't matter. Everyone was retreating inward. Ironsi saw the danger in this and pushed for national unity. He visited every region, meeting local leaders face to face. Chiefs welcomed him with cautious respect. Governors pledged cooperation, but nothing could erase the simple, painful truth. Too many people believed the coup had an ethnic signature. Everywhere Ironsi went, he faced the same unspoken question. "General, Can you really hold this country together? The pressure grew heavier when the Prime Minister's body was finally found weeks later. Balewa, the calm, thoughtful teacher turned statesman, had been killed and dumped near a bush. The discovery reopened wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. Northern soldiers were devastated. The loss was too raw, too personal, and in their grief, anger sharpened. Some blamed the young coup plotters alone. Others blamed Ayonsi for sparing them. A few believed something darker, that he had quietly backed the coup. That last rumor, whispered at first, soon grew close. Inside barracks in Kaduna, Kano, and Zaria, officers began to hold private discussions. Men like Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Mohammed, fiery and bold, struggled to contain their disbelief at the January killings. Younger officers looked to their commanders for direction. No one wanted open mutiny, but no one could accept the idea that the blood spilled in January would go unanswered. Meanwhile, down in Lagos, Ayonsi pushed forward with reforms meant to calm the nation. He eliminated political parties tied to regions. He reshaped the government structure to reduce tribal divisions. He believed unity required breaking old loyalties. But to the north, it felt like their remaining power was being stripped. Ayonsi thought he was healing the fractures. Instead, he was deepening the fault lines. One night in March, an officer rushed into Ayonsi's office with a report. "Sir, northern units are refusing deployment orders." Ayonsi didn't slam the table. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sighed, stood up, and dismissed the officer. He walked to his window and looked out over the dark compound. The palm trees swayed gently. Soldiers patrolled with rifles hanging loosely on their shoulders. Everything looked peaceful. But Ayonsi saw something else. He saw a country teetering on a knife's edge. One misstep, one spark, and the entire federation could collapse. Nigeria had survived its first coup, barely. But the second one was forming in the shadows. One born from revenge, one fueled by grief, one driven by men who believed the nation had been stolen from them. The countdown had already begun. The decree that lit the march. By April, the country was balancing on a tension that everyone felt, but no one said out loud. Lagos kept moving. Cars still crawled through Ikorodu Road. Traders still argued over prices. Ship horns still echoed from Apapa Port. But beneath that busy rhythm, fear was quietly threading its way through every conversation. Iransi believed Nigeria could still be pulled back from the cliff. He believed the nation's wounds were painful but not fatal. So he pushed forward with something he saw as the cure. It was called Decree 34. In his mind, it was the bold step needed to end tribal politics forever. It would replace the loose federation with a single, unified government. One Nigeria, one administration, no more regions acting like competing mini-states. No more ethnic power blocks fighting over influence. To Iransi, it was the medicine the young country desperately needed. But to the north, it felt like chloroform. When the decree became public, the reaction was immediate. Newspapers in Kaduna and Kano exploded with headlines. Politicians who had already lost their most powerful voices in January now felt the federal structure itself slipping away. Traditional leaders called emergency meetings. Governors panicked. Civil servants whispered that Igbo domination was now official policy. Northern officers didn't whisper. They raged. How can he change the entire country without consulting us? He wants to erase the regions. They killed our leaders in January. Now they want to rule us. The room grew hotter with every complaint. Some punched the air. Some paced the floor. A few stayed cold and quiet, which was more dangerous than shouting. One night, a group of senior Northern officers met secretly in Kaduna. The room was dim. Cigarette smoke curled upward into a single flickering bulb. The men around the table weren't joking or exchanging casual banter. These were officers who had fought together, eating together, and grieved together. And every one of them felt betrayed. Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Mohammed leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low but burning. They think they can kill our leaders and then centralize the country under their command. Another officer slammed his fist on the table. We cannot accept this. We will not. Murtala didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. If we don't act now, we may lose the country forever. No one disagreed. The room didn't need a vote. The decision was sitting between them like a loaded weapon. They only needed to pick it up. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Iransi sensed the shift, but underestimated its intensity. Advisors warned him. Security chiefs reported growing hostility in the north. Politicians begged him to slow down. Even close allies urged caution. Iransi believed he could calm things with dialogue. He believed reason still had a chance, but the nation had moved past reason. Grief had hardened into anger. Anger had sharpened into resolve. No policy speech could dissolve that kind of bitterness. Still, he traveled north in May, hoping his presence would reassure the people. He visited Sokoto, Kaduna, and Kano. Crowds welcomed him politely, but their eyes said something else, something guarded, something doubtful, something waiting. The most telling moment came during a meeting with northern traditional rulers. They listened to Iransi respectfully. They nodded in the right places, but when he finished speaking, the room was quiet. Then one of the elders finally broke the silence. "General, we fear your decree may break what you hope to fix." He thanked him, but the word stayed with him. They followed him from palace halls to army guest houses. They sat with him in the back of his staff car. They echoed in his thoughts late at night. And when he returned to Lagos, he found new intelligence waiting on his desk. Northern units were refusing orders. Officers were holding private meetings. Barracks discipline was collapsing. One of his aides spoke quietly. "Sir, there is talk of a counter-coup." Iransi didn't flinch. He simply rubbed his forehead, tired. "We must prevent it." But it was already too late. Across the north, young officers were moving in secret. Messages were passing hand to hand. Weapons were cleaned quietly. Troops were placed on alert with excuses that didn't match their assignments. The fuse had been lit in January. Decree 34 poured petrol on it, and now the fire was crawling fast towards Lagos and towards Iransi. The night the north struck back. The warning signs had been there for weeks, but when the storm finally broke, it came without hesitation. It hit like a hammer in the middle of the night. July 29th, 1966, Ibadan, 1 a.m. The Nigerian sky was dark and heavy, thick with humidity. Crickets buzzed in the grass outside the government house. Most of the compound was quiet. Guards leaned on their rifles, half awake. Inside, General Johnson Aguiyi Iransi slept in the guest room reserved for heads of state. He had come to Ibadan to meet with Western leaders. The day had been long. The night felt calm. But calm was a lie. Far to the north, trucks filled with armed soldiers were already moving. Young officers, fueled by grief and rage, were tightening their plans. They had rehearsed every step. They knew every checkpoint, every guard rotation, every roadblock. Their leaders had agreed the coup of January could not go unanswered. The revenge they believed they were owed was coming tonight. Just after midnight, a signal passed quietly through northern units. It moved from barrack to barrack, whispered from one trusted soldier to another. Move. That one word turned the entire chain of command into something electric. In Abeokuta, Enugu, Kaduna, and Lagos, loyalists to the northern cause took positions. Radios crackled with coded messages. In some barracks, Igbo officers were dragged from their rooms. Some didn't even have time to put on their boots. But the most crucial target was in Ibadan, Ironsi. And standing beside him that night was Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi, the military governor of the Western region. Loyal, brave, steadfast. He had hosted Ironsi as a guest, and in Yoruba culture, a guest is sacred. He would not let the general fall alone. Around 1 a.m., faint noises echoed through the government house. At first, no one recognized them. A truck engine in the distance, boots on gravel, then muffled shouts, radios taken from guards, metal clanking as rifles were cocked. The northern soldiers moved with frightening precision. Ironsi's security details sensed danger too late. Shots rang out near the gate. The night exploded with chaos. Guards scrambled. Some fired back. Others fell before they could react. Fajuyi rushed into Ironsi's room without knocking. His voice was urgent and low. "Sir, they are here." Ironsi sat upright, fully awake now, eyes sharp. He had always known this moment might come. He moved quickly, reaching for his uniform. Outside, gunfire grew louder. Glass shattered. Soldiers shouted orders in harsh tones. Boots slammed against the compound walls. Fajuyi stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance with his body. "You are not alone, sir." Ironsi shook his head. "Fajuyi, they came for me. Let me face them." But Fajuyi didn't move. "Not in my home," he said softly. The fighting intensified. The attackers were closing in. Minutes later, the door burst open. A group of northern soldiers stormed in, rifles raised. Their faces were hard, eyes locked with fury. Some of them had lost mentors, fathers, uncles in the January coup. They believed this moment was justice. "General Ironsi, you're coming with us," one of them backed. Ironsi didn't argue. He slowly raised his hands. Fajuyi stepped forward. "If he goes, I go." The soldiers hesitated. They didn't come for Fajuyi, but his stance left no room for negotiation. "Then both of you," the officer growled. They were dragged out into the compound. The air smelled of gunpowder and dust. Ironsi walked with calm dignity. Fajuyi stayed at his side, jaw set, refusing to show fear. For a moment, the scene froze in time. Two leaders, one nation on its knees, and a future about to be rewritten. What happened next was swift and brutal. Both men were taken to a nearby bush path. The soldiers didn't prolong it. They didn't speak much. Their minds were fixed on revenge, not conversation. Shots cracked through the night. By dawn, General Aguiyi Iransi and Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi were gone. Nigeria had just crossed a point it could never return from. The counter-coup wasn't just successful, it unleashed a wave. Across the north, soldiers and civilians turned on Igbo residents. Whole neighborhoods erupted in violence. Thousands fled south in panic. Train stations overflowed with people trying to escape. Bodies lay in streets where they had been ambushed. Families were torn apart. Fear became the new language of the nation. Nigeria was stumbling towards something darker, something deadlier, something that would shape the next decade of bloodshed. The country was no longer wounded. It was bleeding heavily. The country split, and a young officer stepped forward. The sun rose over a broken country. News of Aronsi and Fajuyi's deaths raced across Nigeria like a spark in dry grass. Radios hissed with confused reports. Northern soldiers were still hunting Igbo officers in the barracks. Civilians flooded the roads, desperate to reach safety in the east. Everywhere, fear became currency. Suspicion became instinct. And in Lagos, the seat of power was suddenly empty. The counter-coup officers had removed Aronsi, but they hadn't agreed on what came next. They had expected the nation to fall neatly into their hands. Instead, they found themselves staring into a political vacuum with no plan to fill it. For 2 days, Nigeria had no head of state. The country drifted like a ship without a captain. Ministries froze. Governors didn't know who to report to. Diplomats waited for instructions that never came. And inside the Ikeja cantonment, a tense debate exploded among the northern officers who now controlled the capital. Some wanted the north to break away entirely. Others wanted the army to stay united but under their command. A few even proposed placing a northern civilian in charge. But one thing was clear. The officer who led Nigeria next had to be someone they trusted. Someone military, someone northern, someone young, someone tough. That name came quickly. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon. Just 31 years old, clear-headed, calm under pressure, respected by both northern and southern officers. A man who didn't seek power but wasn't afraid to take responsibility either. Gowon was summoned to Lagos quietly. He walked into the cantonment aware of the gravity around him. The air felt heavy, full of the unspoken weight of what had just happened. When he entered the room where the senior northern officers were gathered, every eye turned to him. One of the colonels stepped forward. "We want you to take control," he said. Gowon blinked, stunned. "Me? You are the only one the army will accept," another officer added. "The country needs a leader now before everything collapses." Gowon wasn't a man who chased ambition. He wasn't a political schemer. He had never imagined becoming head of state in a moment like this. He looked at the faces around him, men who were furious with the January coup, men who felt betrayed, men who now held the gun but not the chain of command. Nigeria was a volcano, and he was being asked to stand at the mouth of it. Gowon finally exhaled. "If this is for the unity of the country," he said quietly, "I will do my best." Hours later, he stood before the nation in a short and stern broadcast. His voice was steady, but the world around him was burning. He condemned Aronsi's death. He condemned the mutiny. He promised to heal the country. He promised equality. He promised peace. But peace was already slipping away. Because down in Enugu, in the eastern region, another man was watching the situation unfold with growing alarm. Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, governor of the eastern region. Educated, sharp, charismatic, determined to protect his people at any cost. And what he saw from Lagos convinced him that eastern lives were now in danger. Aronsi was dead. Thousands of Igbos had been killed in reprisal attacks in the north. The military government in Lagos was now dominated by the same northern officers whose men had just carried out those killings. Ojukwu didn't trust them. Not anymore. Not after July. He refused to recognize Gowon's government. He argued that by military seniority, Brigadier Ogundipe should have taken command. But Ogundipe had been sidelined, threatened, rendered powerless. To Ojukwu, this wasn't a lawful transition. It was a takeover. And that meant the East would have to protect itself, alone if necessary. A line had been drawn. Gowon on one side, Ojukwu on the other. Between them stood a nation bleeding from 2 coups in 6 months. The stage was set. 2 young leaders, 2 visions, 1 country breaking apart. And what came next would push Nigeria into the darkest chapter of its history. The edge of secession. By late 1966, Nigeria's fractures were no longer just political, they were visceral. Streets that had once hummed with traders, children, and musicians now carried the echo of fear. Trains headed east were packed with fleeing Igbo families, eyes wide, hands clutched tight to whatever belongings they could carry. In villages and towns along the way, whispers of massacres reached them before the travelers even arrived. Each step forward felt like walking on knives. Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu watched this from the eastern region, pacing the halls of Government House in Enugu. His aides tried to calm him. "Sir, we can still negotiate," one said. "Gowon has reached out. We can find a compromise." Ojukwu shook his head, his jaw tight. Compromise is meaningless when our people are being slaughtered. Outside, the air was thick with tension. Soldiers in the east mobilized quietly, preparing to defend communities, highways, and towns. For Ojukwu, leadership meant survival first, politics second. Every conversation, every movement of troops, every whispered report mattered. The young governor knew that hesitation could be fatal. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Gowon's government tried to assert control. Meetings ran late into the night. Advisors debated security measures, public announcements, and curfews. Gowon was steady, measured, aware that a single misstep could ignite the fires already spreading across the nation. But the northern officers in his circle were restless. They wanted vengeance. They wanted retribution for January. Gowon had to balance these competing demands while avoiding full-scale civil war. Diplomats arrived, reporting urgent concerns. Foreign embassies were alarmed. Business leaders were warning of economic collapse. And all over Nigeria, ordinary citizens were wondering who would protect us, who would keep the trains running, the markets open, the cities from erupting into full-scale ethnic bloodshed. It was a question with no easy answer. In Enugu, Ojukwu made a decision, not out of ambition, not out of pride, but out of necessity. If the eastern region could not rely on Lagos, it would have to act independently. Defense plans were drawn, weapons were allocated, communication lines established, local militias trained, Every step was calculated, each one laying the foundation for what would come. At the same time, the young leaders of the North plotted their own moves. Murtala Muhammad and others quietly consolidated their positions, strengthening northern units and preparing for potential retaliation. Intelligence networks were established, tracking eastern troop movements. Nigeria was now a chessboard, and every piece was moving toward a confrontation that no one truly wanted, but everyone felt inevitable. By the end of 1966, the seeds of division were clear. Trust was gone. Cities were segregating along ethnic lines. The army itself was split. Families had been torn apart. Fear, grief, and anger became constant companions for millions. And in the East, Ojukwu prepared quietly, determined to protect his people, even if it meant breaking away from the country he had once served within. Nigeria's first coups had already rewritten the rules. January had shown the dangers of ambition, loyalty, and tribal tensions. July had proven that revenge could move faster than reason. Now the stage was set for the ultimate test. Could the nation survive a conflict born not just of politics, but of fear, memory, and survival itself? Every move forward carried weight. Every decision could trigger another cascade of violence. And somewhere in the back of the minds of leaders on both sides, they all knew that the balance of the country's future rested on fragile threads that were already fraying. Nigeria was no longer just a nation in turmoil. It was a nation on the edge of fracture. One spark would determine whether it healed or burned.
The road to Biafra. As 1967 began, tension in Nigeria was no longer political. It had become existential. Refugee camps in the eastern region swelled with thousands of Igbos fleeing from the north. Families huddled together under tarps, listening to the wind as if it carried whispers of what might come next. Mothers held children tightly. Fathers patrolled the perimeters, and every adult carried the memory of January and July like a live coal in their chest. Ojukwu moved decisively. He strengthened eastern defenses, built communication networks, and ensured that key infrastructure could remain operational if conflict erupted. But he also tried to keep a thread of diplomacy alive, sending envoys to Lagos, pleading for assurances of protection for eastern citizens. Each message was met with cautious responses, but trust had already been destroyed. In Lagos, Gowon faced his own battle. He inherited a country fractured along ethnic lines, with suspicion in every corridor of power. The army itself was split. Northern officers demanded action against the East. Southern officers, still shocked by the massacres, felt that Ironsi's death had gone unanswered. Gowon attempted to navigate this treacherous path with calm pragmatism, hoping to prevent another eruption of violence, but his options were limited. Every delay risked further chaos. Every move risked alienating one side or another. By May, the situation reached a breaking point. Talks between Lagos and Enugu failed repeatedly. The Eastern leadership, convinced that their people were under threat, began preparing for the worst. In a tense speech to Eastern military officers and political leaders, Ojukwu laid out the stark reality. If Lagos cannot guarantee our safety, if the government cannot protect our people, then we have no choice but to act in self-defense. We will not allow our people to be exterminated. The words were measured, but carried the weight of inevitability. For Ojukwu, this was not ambition, it was survival. And survival, he believed,
required the eastern region to be capable of self-rule if necessary. On July 6, 1967, Ojukwu made the fateful declaration: the eastern region would secede from Nigeria and become the independent Republic of Biafra. The move shocked the nation. International observers were stunned. In the east, the declaration was met with a mixture of hope, relief, and fear. In the north and Lagos, it was viewed as rebellion, an act that could not be tolerated. The stage was now fully set for civil war. Nigeria, a country still young, had been fractured by coups, revenge, and mistrust. Two leaders, Gowon and Ojukwu, stood on opposite sides, both claiming legitimacy, both determined to protect their people, and both aware that the decisions made in the coming months would shape the country for decades. Behind closed doors, planners in both camps began mapping strategies. Roads, bridges, and railways became lifelines or potential choke points. Troop movements were tracked meticulously. Communication lines were secured. And for ordinary Nigerians, life became a waiting game, waiting for orders, waiting for news, waiting for the inevitable. The coups of 1966 had ignited a chain reaction. They had exposed tribal tensions, institutional weaknesses, and the fragility of national unity. The death of Ironsi had left a vacuum that Gowon tried to fill, but the distrust and anger unleashed by January and July had set the nation on a collision course. Nigeria was no longer just recovering from coups. It was preparing for civil war. The divisions were deep. The stakes were life and death. And the story of 1966, the coups, the assassinations, the reprisals, was now inseparable from the story of Biafra, the East, and the young leaders who would define a generation. The lessons of 1966 were written in blood, fear, and courage, and they would echo across Nigeria for decades.
Legacy of the coups. Years later, the shadow of 1966 still stretched over Nigeria. The two coups, the January attempt and the July counter-coup, had reshaped the nation's identity in ways no policy or speech could undo. They had demonstrated the fragility of unity, the volatility of grief, and the consequences of vengeance carried through the corridors of power. In the East, the memory of massacres haunted survivors. Families who had fled north told stories of betrayal, loss, and survival. These narratives became the foundation of Biafra's identity, driving both political resolve and cultural cohesion. Ojukwu's leadership, controversial and decisive, was inseparable from this experience. To many, he was not a rebel, he was a protector, the guardian of a people who had been abandoned. In Lagos and the North, the counter-coup reshaped the military and political hierarchy. Gowon's leadership, young and cautious, was defined by the need to stabilize a country teetering on collapse. Northern officers consolidated influence in the federal army, creating a dynamic where trust was scarce, and every decision had a ripple effect across ethnic lines. It was a fragile equilibrium, held together by pragmatism, fear, and the constant awareness that one wrong move could spark another crisis. The coups also exposed Nigeria's institutional weaknesses. The army, which was supposed to be a professional, apolitical body, became both an instrument of governance and a tool for political revenge. Civil structures, still young and underdeveloped,
struggled to maintain legitimacy. Political parties fractured, trust in leadership eroded, and ordinary citizens learned that national identity was both fragile and contested. Yet, even amid chaos, there were moments of African resilience. Leaders like Ironsi had tried, against all odds, to hold the country together. Figures like Fajui had embodied courage and loyalty, standing by their leaders even at the cost of their lives. Ordinary Nigerians, civilians, traders, teachers, soldiers navigated violence and displacement with determination. They rebuilt communities, protected neighbors, and resisted despair. Their stories remind us that Africa's brilliance and humanity endure even when institutions falter. The lessons of 1966 are complex. The coups demonstrated how quickly ambition and fear can fracture a nation. They showed the dangers of ethnic distrust in political systems and the devastating consequences of revenge. But they also revealed courage, moral conviction, and the capacity of leaders and citizens to respond under extreme pressure. For Nigeria, the coups of 1966 were not just historical events. They were the turning points that defined the military, political, and social trajectory of the country. They set the stage for the Biafra, civil war, and decades of rebuilding and reflection. They also became a cautionary tale about leadership, unity, and the responsibility that comes with power. And as we look back, it is clear the story of 1966 is not just about loss, betrayal, or revenge. It is about the choices Africans made in the face of extreme crisis. It is about the courage to act, the will to protect communities, and the enduring struggle to build a nation that could rise above its divisions. History remembers coups as moments of violence, but Rise of African Nations remembers the people, the leaders, the soldiers, the families who navigated fear, grief, and chaos with resilience. Their stories are not forgotten. They are the heartbeat of Nigeria's complex journey and a reminder that even in the darkest chapters, African nations continue to rise. Thank you for following this story. Remember to like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe, and read the full blog in the description. Show your support so we can continue creating more content, uncovering untold histories, and celebrating the resilience of African nations.